course, of being prudent managers of their enterprises. All of this is to say that capitalism is an extraordinarily clever system, right? It has an automatic recoil built into it that punishes us for trying to dismantle it or even curb capitalist power in any way. And it doesn't actually require an intensive process of interest aggregation among capitalists. They don't need to sit in a boardroom, though they often do, and they often do conspire against us in sort of shadowy, smoke-filled rooms, but they don't need to, actually. All they have to do is just watch the bottom line and try to maximize profits. And we'll get punished for trying to curb the capitalist class power. So Lindblom, he calls this an automatic recoil mechanism, and he says that once you get through all of the layers leading up to it, you know, the bought-off politicians and the reactionary ideology and so forth, this is really the main thing that makes progressive change difficult. If this were a video game, this is like the final boss, right? So what this passage basically refers to is what's called capital strikes. That's when, you know, workers can go on strike, right? That means that workers are, you know, they're withholding their labor. But capitalists can also go on a strike. They can withhold their power, which is investment. It's also, there's the issue, another issue of capital flight, which is different from capital strikes. Capital flight is when businesses take their operations elsewhere entirely to a place where the climate for business is more favorable. Amazon, you wouldn't call it capital flight because they hadn't actually built HQ2 in New York, but you saw this process at play, right? Yeah, sometimes capital flight is good. So, you know, it's possible that were Bernie Sanders to begin to implement a truly radical agenda, capital flight and capital strike would both occur to varying degrees, and forcing the economy into a recession. And if it were bad enough, people may not forgive him or us for a very long time. So knowing this, Bernie's going to need to proceed very cautiously. And indeed, he may proceed too cautiously, letting people down who voted for him because they wanted transformative change. This sounds absolutely terrible. Why are you telling me these things? I like Bernie Sanders, right? I'm sorry, this is true. This is a part of the reality. But why would anyone want to elect Bernie Sanders after what I just said? Because it's exactly as Lindblom says, the market is a prison, and we have to break free somehow in order to guarantee a decent standard of living for all people, which is our goal here in this room, right? So things might go quite poorly, but things could also go extremely well for both the working class and for socialists, even if there were capital flight and capital strikes. So even though Bernie himself didn't arise organically out of a 21st century socialist movement, he did help create one. And our task right now is to build it into a mass movement. Having a self-proclaimed democratic socialist as the president of the United States would legitimate our ideology immediately and promote it continuously. People are going to like a lot of the stuff he does, even if capital doesn't like it, and we as socialists are obviously going to benefit from that. But even more importantly, some of the reforms that he will be able to steward will put the working class on better footing to fight the capitalist class that's holding us hostage, even as that capitalist class is retaliating, right? So in precisely the way that Donald Trump has emboldened the right, Bernie will be a huge movement builder for the left if he is president. And Trump understands the propaganda value of his actions very well. I would contend that not only does Bernie understand it too, but Bernie actually has much better intuition and instincts about this than Donald Trump does. So you could see that Bernie would probably not only try to actually pass real legislation that would materially empower working people, but he would also be using his office as a bully pulpit to build the left by making, you know, like opening gambits and challenging capital in ways that have propagandistic value, right? And that heighten contradictions and that polarize United States society along class lines and raise the expectations of the working class and so on and so forth. So, you know, I wrote an article for the most recent issue of Jacobin about executive orders. Executive orders are just some things that the president can just do unilaterally. They just can issue them, and they issue hundreds of them. FDR issued like 3,000 of them, many of which actually constituted the New Deal. So they're actually extraordinarily important for business. And so I wrote an article about, you know, all the things that, you know, all of the executive orders that Bernie Sanders could actually issue if he were president. And in it I wrote, and I want to make this super clear, that executive orders are ephemeral and they can be reversed by the president who comes next, they can be overturned by the Supreme Court, they can be nullified by new legislation in Congress, so, you know, they're not a silver bullet. In order to make lasting change, we can't rely on directives from a single politician. There's no question about that. We need a mass movement from below that can send progressives and democratic socialist representatives into the state and can engage in protests, strikes, and other disruptive activity outside the state that creates crises which officials are forced to respond to regardless of their ideology, right? So that's the background. But building that movement is actually not mutually exclusive with aggressive executive action. If a hypothetical president, Bernie Sanders, were to pass hundreds or thousands of executive orders intended to drag the country left and propagandize and curb the power of the capitalist class, this could have a couple of major salutary effects on the movement building project itself. First, ambitious executive orders can expand the popular imagination and raise the expectations of the working class majority. Policy ideas that seemed unfeasible or off limits can instantly be legitimated, and so can the politics that animate them to some degree, reshaping the political terrain. For example, Trump's travel ban, that actually has been, deemed unconstitutional, and, there's been massive fights over it, legislative fights, but by issuing that travel ban, he actually reshaped the terrain of American politics, right? And he legitimated Islamophobia and xenophobia just through the act of issuing that executive order. So Bernie Sanders can use these powers for good, right? And second, I want to point out that, executive orders are not always going to be contested. Sometimes they're perfectly constitutional and you can just do things that actually change American politics. So adjustments that are made by executive order can mitigate the power of a handful of capitalists over the vast majority of people. And that makes it easier for working class people and for socialists to organize and participate in political activity aimed at longer term and more holistic change, right? So again, this is not a mutual exclusivity between building the movement that can create disruptive crises outside of the state and taking aggressive executive action in the state if President Bernie Sanders were to actually exist. So I came up with a dozen examples or so of these kinds of executive orders. It was a really fun exercise. It made me feel very excited, but I'm just going to leave you with two to give you a sense of what's possible. First, Sanders could issue an executive order establishing new priorities across federal agencies that administer social programs. So in April of last year, Donald Trump issued exactly this. He basically, it was like an overarching list of priorities that all federal agencies that issue social programs had to adhere to. And he called it the principles of economic mobility, which is just garbage. And he said that, he justified it by saying many of the programs that are designed to help families have instead delayed economic independence and perpetuated poverty and weakened family bonds. Yeah. And this was his justification for basically telling all of these agencies to do new stuff. He wants work requirements for social, benefits and programs, and reserving benefits only for the lowest income people, which is means testing. He wants to reduce quote-unquote wasteful spending by consolidating or eliminating federal programs that are duplicative or ineffective. This is a fancy way of saying austerity and cutting social programs. And then he also said that he wanted to empower the private sector to step in and solve problems that are currently delegated to the federal government. And this is privatization. So in these sort of I wrote this sort of memo, this executive order that's got all of this jargon in it, and it's all full of euphemisms, but he's basically called for means testing austerity and privatization in every single agency that administers social programs in the entire country on the federal level, right? So what could Bernie Sanders do? He could immediately reverse this executive order and issue one of his own, ordering agencies to operate instead according to the principles of economic equality, not mobility, right? And then he could tell all of them that they should be focusing on universal program design instead of means testing, commodification instead of privatization, and redistribution instead of austerity. He could do that by himself. He could just issue this executive order, and it would be like an overarching set of principles, guiding principles for the entire federal government. So this is the one I really want to leave you on. Check this out. When Congress was first given the power to issue and collect student loans in 1958, the Department of Education also received a power from Congress called compromise and settlement, which allows them to waive the right to collect on those debts. And then the Higher Education Act of 1965 solidified that power in the hands of the Secretary of Education. Sanders could issue an executive order to direct his Secretary of Education to immediately write off all student loan debt for which the federal government is the creditor, which is the majority of student loan debt. So that's the majority of student loan debt in the United States, but it doesn't end there. executive order could direct the Department of Education to assume all of the other debt from all of the other people who have debt to private lenders, and then he could just write that off too, reducing America's student loan burden from 1.5 trillion to 0 with a single executive order. So now you've heard the absolute best and worst of what a Bernie Sanders presidency could look like. My takeaway, and I hope you'll agree, is that of course it's enormously perilous, but we don't win socialism in one fell swoop anyway. And more importantly, we cannot avoid capitalist retaliation for socialist advancement. We cannot avoid it. We will have to contend with it. We do not have a choice. And in fact, we already contend with it every day, such as when workers want to unionize and the boss says, I might have to shut down this branch and then you'll lose your jobs if you unionize. And the teacher strikes are a response to retaliation from capital. The dismantling of public education is retaliation in the form of privatization and austerity for unionizing public education. That's what's happening here. But as the teachers show, that retaliation can actually bring opportunities for struggle. And in struggle is where we form a mass working class movement, right? So, yeah. So we can either have this fight against capitalist retaliation privately, quietly, constantly, you know, in an atomized way all across the country, little individual struggles, or we can have it in front of a mass audience while we are simultaneously making bold claims on the future and heightening people's understanding of the battle lines. The road to revolution is obviously full of twists and turns and victories and setbacks. The point is we have to be brave and ambitious and take chances when they are presented to us, or else we will remain inactive and marginal and never break out of the market prison called capitalism. A Bernie Sanders presidency would finally set us free from the neoliberal no alternative paradigm that I just told you about. And ultimately, it's irresponsible of people who profess to want to change the world to say no to such an opportunity, come what may. Thank you.
So yeah, I think wow, that's hard to follow. There are a lot of dangers, but also a lot of opportunities in a Bernie 2020 presidency. But of course, he might not win, right? But he might not, it's hypothetical, or he might, and regardless, what I think many of us in RDSA are interested in is what a mass movement behind Bernie could do. You know, we're not just going to get Bernie socks and like have him be our demagogue. Like, we're interested in what a mass movement behind Bernie could do. And I think part of that, you know, comes from, like, as young socialists, we know that politics is more than just the electoral arena, right? And we all agree that there's more to politics than just elections. We've seen an incredible, spine-breaking educator strike wave happening across the country right now. A mass popular movement behind Medicare for All is sweeping even liberal politicians by storm. There are things happening outside of the electoral arena right now that are exciting a lot of us in this room, and DSA is playing a role in those struggles. So Megan, you talked about this a little bit, about the disruptions outside the state and how they relate to the electoral arena. But we all know that DSA's 11-fold growth in the last 7 years has been tied to elections. Our membership bumps have been tied to people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez winning, right? To Bernie Sanders kind of creating what DSA is today in many ways. So I like to use the word gateway drug for what Bernie, you know, and the electoral arena does for broader democratic socialist politics. Right? We're interested in how, as socialists, how can we use this electoral arena to build working class consciousness and working class power? So why is it a gateway drug? How is it a gateway drug? Yeah, take it away. Anyone can go first. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I think you're completely spot on, Nina, when you say that, you know, politics is much more than elections, and we as socialists intuitively know that. But the reality is that most people think that politics is only elections, and we really have to contend with that. Elections are the time in American life when people are thinking about politics, and specifically thinking about, like, who's getting screwed, who's doing the screwing, and why everything is so unfair. And that's when DSA needs to be there to provide a framework, a socialist framework, for people to think about this and articulate this. And so I want to talk about why we should get involved in specific electoral campaigns. I think we should actually really think about why we should do elections, beyond what I just said. And that's what we did here in the East Bay when we ran campaigns for Javanka Beckles and for Prop 10 this past fall. We ran a primary campaign for Javanka and squeaked her through the primary with 714 votes. And we kind of realized after that primary campaign that we didn't really know what we were doing, and we didn't actually really know why we were doing it. We had never actually articulated that. So we focused on putting together a set of political goals about why East Bay DSA is campaigning for Javanka Beckles and will campaign for Proposition 10. And our political goals were the following. It was, the first one, and the most important one, was to increase class consciousness across the East Bay. Using Javanka and the Prop 10 campaign as mouthpieces for our politics and getting as many people exposed to socialist politics as possible. The second thing was to develop relationships and coalitions with other progressive organizations, and especially organized labor,